The Gospels are written to convince people that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. They're trying to get people to believe. And so what they're writing down is completely kind of geared towards pushing that particular agenda. They are the original spin doctors. So the whole idea of spin and redaction and all of these things that have kind of been in the news over the last few decades are there exactly in the ancient writers.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at the Know Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, the Know Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. Helen, thank you so much for joining me on the Know Show. I'm really pleased to have you.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
So when we were parsing through, different academic profiles, we stumbled upon your profile, and one of the things that stood out to me in particular was the fact that you look at obviously you're an academic who's essentially in sort of looking at Jesus scholarship and the history of Jesus and Christianity. But what's really interesting is that you look at it, what I understood was through narrative and through sort of story and biography. So tell us a bit about how you got to researching this sort of aspect of Christianity.
Oh, dear me. Well, I suppose I consider myself a biblical historian. So I'm interested, my title here is Professor of Christian Origins. So I'm interested in the first 100 years or so of Christianity and that whole sort of Jewish background in which it emerged, and also, I suppose, the Greek and Roman background. But I didn't like history at school at all. I gave it up as soon as I possibly could. I thought it was really dull. And what I really liked was maths and puzzles, and but I've always been a big reader. I liked literature, and at first I didn't really kind of make the connection, I think, between history and stories. It was only sort of strangely enough when at school we did a thing called the synoptic problem, which is looking at the literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because there's clearly a link between them. And nowadays people explain that by saying that Mark wrote first and then Matthew and Luke used Mark in their own Gospels. And that just suddenly kind of appealed to me, because it was that whole sort of puzzle thing, but it was dealing with literature as well. And I think for the first time, thought of the Gospel writers as real people who were creating literature and using sources and just kind of pulling from Mark, plundering his work in a way that we would call plagiarism today. So I think I found it, I mean, for me, there's sort of two levels of story. There's the story of what actually happened and the whole problem about how we get back to that. And, what are facts? And can we ever get fact? Is it possible to get back to uninterpreted fact? And I would say no. But the second level of story is the Gospels themselves, or the works of Josephus, who's a Jewish historian who virtually everything we know about first century Israel comes from Josephus. And these people are writing stories. They're not historical reports. The Gospels are written to convince people that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. They're trying to get people to believe. And so what they're writing down is completely kind of geared towards pushing that particular agenda. They are the original spin doctors. So the whole idea of spin and redaction and all of these things that have kind of been in the news over the last few decades are there exactly in the ancient writers. So I find that really interesting to try and see why it is an author tells us about something in a particular way.
That's fascinating, because when you look at history, I mean, there's a light that you bring to it that I've never considered before, which is it's almost like problem solving, and you're sort of seeing how, for example, there's a link between different authors. But it's also very interesting that you point to the fact that they're the first spin doctors. And what's very interesting is the literary use, or the literary tools that they use in sort of describing Jesus and describing his virtues. And so tell us a little bit more about this spin element and how you feel it works as spin.
Well, I suppose, and I'm aware that spin is a term that a lot of people might find slightly offensive if you're talking about the Gospels, but I mean, it's just exactly the same thing. I think it works in many different ways. So, for example, when Mark writes about Jesus, he is the first, as far as we know, he's the first narrative account of Jesus. And he's writing an ancient biography. Ancient biographies tended to highlight a person's virtues. And obviously, most of us are a mixture of virtues and vices. And it's, I mean, you do get ancient biographers like Plutarch reflecting on his craft, and he says, you know, you have to kind of make the most of certain elements and maybe kind of, you know, quietly forget certain other ones. And so, of course, when Mark is writing his biography, he makes the most of some things in the life of Jesus and just doesn't mention other things. So already is that process of selection. Mark is clearly somebody who completely and utterly believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And so everything he writes is trying to tell the author what he passionately believes. And there's an interesting level there, I think, between factual history and the way you describe things. So the ancient biographies largely are a series of anecdotes. And I mean, we're used to anecdotes in the present, and, you know, somebody dies, everybody is telling stories about them. Oh, remember the time when he did this, remember that. And they kind of grow in the telling. And we're all aware of those sort of apocryphal stories about people that might not necessarily have happened, but there's something about them that really captures the essential soul of the person. And so people keep telling them, even when they say, I'm not sure this happened, but there is a story. And I think there's a similar element there in the Gospels, in that, particularly with stories that strike us as really strange and unbelievable, you know, Jesus walking on the water, for example, who knows whether that happened or not? I mean, your judgment there is simply going to be a question of whether you think Jesus could change the laws of nature. And that's something that the historian cannot decide upon. But I think what you can see in stories like that is that the authors are trying to show you that Jesus is the sort of person who could walk on water. He is such an exalted person that these are the kind of things he did. And of course, they're all trying to bring you to faith in Jesus as the Son of God. So I think from that point of view, there is that element of spin there. We are being shown a very particular side of Jesus. And in many ways, because Mark is the first one to put that narrative together, I think to a large extent that the picture we have of Jesus is Mark's picture of Jesus. And then later on, Matthew, Luke come along, even John comes along, and they use Mark's story, but they tweak it in different ways. And one of the things that really got me interested in biblical studies in the first place was comparing a passage from Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel. And you can see exactly how Matthew has altered that. And from doing, if you do that sort of throughout the whole of the gospel, you can build together a picture of the things that Matthew is interested in. So Matthew makes it more Jewish. Matthew is keener on kingship. Matthew has all these interests that kind of play out as he's using Mark. So again, you've got that element of spin. It's Mark's gospel rewritten for Matthew's audience. And I find all of that fascinating, thinking of the human element in all of this, that's rewriting these stories for new groups of Christians.
That human element is quite interesting because, when you're talking about ancient biography, can you sort of elaborate on whether the mechanisms they use, like how do you differentiate between them being spin or them just being literary tradition, in that as a biographer you have to talk about someone's virtues and not talk negatively about them?
Yeah, well, you can talk about negatively. There are some negative biographies where the character is full of vice, and the whole point there is that people read these biographies and see how you don't behave. But in general, they tend to be quite flat characters. They tend to be good or bad. They're not kind of they're not exploring character in the way that, say, a Greek tragedy would be. They are very much kind of showing you the virtues. So I think actually what you say is the really hard question, and it's also what makes it really interesting. How much of this is spin? How much of it did happen? And I'm endlessly fascinated by trying to get behind the texts. I do want to know. I want to know what Jesus was like. I want to know what he said. I want to know what his followers were like. How many of them were women? Were there just the 12? Were there women there too? All of these questions I'm endlessly fascinated by. But at the same time, I completely and utterly realize that our only access to Jesus is through the literary medium, and that itself is written for very different purposes. They're not written to tell us exactly what Jesus was like as a historical person. They're written to convince people that he was the Son of God. And that is a really difficult thing. How much from those accounts can we say, yes, this is history? Because of course there must be some history there. There's got to be a level of history. But how far do you kind of push that? At what point do you say, I don't think this happened historically? Now we are in the realm of sort of interpretation, and biblical scholars differ. Some will still try to say we have a lot of history in the Gospels, and some will say most of it is story, and some people say we just don't know, and it's not worth even trying.
So as a historian, how do you navigate context? Because you mentioned this one passage that had sort of 3 different filters depending on what the author was interested in, and presumably the reason why they done it is so that it appeals to the readership or the audience, the listeners at the time. So how do you navigate, as a historian, how do you navigate the context in which these passages were written, and how do you sort of try to establish a thread that links back to what Jesus was like?
Yeah, I think we're very lucky in some ways with the Gospels in that we have a fairly good idea of their context in general terms. I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly what city they were written in, and I couldn't tell you exactly when they were written. But in the case of Mark, for example, we're fairly confident that it was written in the 70s AD, so sometime after the fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, and the temple was burnt to the ground in AD 70. And probably to some extent, that was the catalyst for a lot of this written material that comes just after that. So I think it's very likely Mark was written in the 70s. It's clearly from an author who is very Jewish, if it's possible to be very Jewish. He was a Jewish author who has come to the Christian faith, and that Jewish background informs everything he says about Jesus. But at the same time, he chooses a Greco-Roman form, a biography, and very likely he's writing in a Greek city of the Roman Empire, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and he's writing in Greek. So he is a mixture. And for me, this is really fascinating, trying to work out the Jewish elements and the Greek and Roman elements in all of this. And to what extent are these ideas and elements that you find already in Jesus? Because Jesus, of course, was Jewish, but by that time, the whole of Israel-Palestine was thoroughly Greek and Roman in its outlook. So how many of these things do go back to Jesus, but how many of them have been enhanced or changed in some way because of the author's Jewish heritage or Greco-Roman context? And I think all you can do is try and immerse yourself in all of this and try and understand what the author is doing in our literary texts, and then work out how much you think this is going back to the historical record, and how much you think he is engaging with the context of his own day in a particular way, perhaps to show that Jesus, not the emperor, is the Son of God, or perhaps some anti-Jewish elements because of synagogue Christian hostility at the time. So it's just a question of immersing yourself in it all and looking for possibilities and probabilities. And unfortunately, we can never get any further than that.
Mm-hmm. And that links very nicely to, the fact that you contest the day in which Jesus died. And you use a very interesting framework for this, because, you look back and a lot of the theoretical concepts that, or the I guess the theoretical lens that you're using is sort of social memory theory, and how, memory evolves, according to what is important for the communities at the time, etc. So talk to us more about, first of all, why did you choose to look at this social memory theory? What was about that?
Well, actually, it came from a personal experience. My grandmother died when I was about 20, and I went to the funeral, and in my mind, she had died on New Year's Eve. And as I thought about it over the years, I thought of my grandma. She was in an old person's home. She'd been playing the piano the night before she died. I imagined at a New Year's Eve party, and as the new year came, her heart just stopped, and that was my image of my grandma's death. And then my dad is very keen on family history, and he was writing out the sort of family tree, and he'd got my grandma dying on the 27th of December, and I said, no, that's not right. She died New Year's Eve. And so, of course, everybody was asked. We had to dig out the death certificate. And I realized that I was wrong. She had died on the 27th of December. And I was an adult, and I had known this. I was there when the phone call came. But somehow in my mind, it had swapped to a more meaningful, more poignant story. For me, dying on New Year's Eve, just kind of,
right,
particularly that kind of a gentle death that she had, she was in her 90s. She just didn't want to see another year. And that was how I made sense of it. And I found that really kind of blew my mind. I thought, how could I have been so wrong on that? And then I suppose I was, one of the great questions in New Testament study is over the date of the crucifixion. And although people know that Mark's chronology is highly theological, because he puts the Eucharist at the same time as the Passover meal, so he makes connections there. And people know that John's different dating is also highly theological, because he links Jesus's death with the death of the Paschal lambs in the temple. And people know that they're both theological, but what they tend to do is to make up their mind on one or the other. They say this one is historical, and then the other guy just rewrote it in a more theological way, as if the authors were sort of sitting in little offices thinking, I'll change that, and I have got a better story here, I'll just make a few changes. And it just seemed to me, as I was looking at that, I think I was probably teaching the first years about this, and I suddenly thought, this is exactly my experience. And what we have here is simply two different variants on that. So everybody knew that Jesus died around about Passover, perhaps a week before. I think that's most likely. Probably when Jesus first came to Jerusalem, he was got rid of pretty quickly. And that would have made sense for the Jewish hierarchy, also for the Romans. But in the course of time, different Christian groups have made sense of this in different ways. So Mark's community have linked Jesus's inauguration of the Eucharist with the Passover meal, and all of those ideas there of liberation from bondage in Egypt, and liberation from oppression and God's covenant, whilst at the same time a different Christian group known to John are making direct links between Jesus as the Paschal Lamb dying as a sacrifice on the cross. And so I think they're both, what's interesting about the social memory, I think, is that what I'm trying to do is to look for the point behind both of these narratives that might have given rise to two different stories. And for me, the best explanation is that Jesus died about a week or so before, and that in the course of time, the sort of magnetic pull of the great feast. I mean, the Passover is such an important thing in Jewish life in the first century that, of course, Jews try to make sense of Jesus's death and life to some extent by pinning his death very closely to the Passover. And we have this in other Jewish sources lots and lots of times, events being placed on particular feast days to try and kind of give extra resonance there.
Mm-hmm. So this concept of making sense of someone's death now on a personal level for you, but also on a historical, on a professional level, also you get to sort of see this. In both cases, do you think that there is a link between dates that we perceive certain things to have happened, and between purely symbolic events? So, for example, the Passover and the 7th of April. The symbolism is there. Do you think this is essentially how history has been written?
Yeah, well, certainly, like I say, you get a lot of examples in Jewish literature. So the day that the Second Temple fell to the Romans is exactly the same date that the First Temple fell to the Babylonians. So, you do get these connections, and the whole point of them in ancient literature is to show that things don't happen randomly. The whole point is to show that there is a plan behind this. And for an ancient person, of course, the whole point is God is in charge. God is directing history. And when else is God going to have these things happen? Of course, they're going to happen at the feasts. And so that's going on in the background there. I suppose the big difference nowadays is that, we just get onto Google, or we look at our birth certificate or our death certificate. I mean, in the same way that with my grandma, if we hadn't had a death certificate, we'd have had no way of knowing. And I would have been utterly certain that I was right on all of that. I would have said, well, I was there, I know.
Yeah.
And in the ancient world, of course, people don't have that. And so, and two, I think at moments of birth or death, those are very emotional times when you're not necessarily kind of thinking too much about the date. In the ancient world too, very difficult to date things, because there were a variety of calendars, some of them solar, some of them lunar, some of them counting Roman consuls, some of them counting Jewish years. So a variety of ways of working out the dates of things. And it would actually have been very difficult to know precisely when anything happened. Even people themselves don't know exactly the year even of their birth in the first century. And there are all these tax returns from Egypt where people sort of say around about 20 years old, and people don't actually know. And I think it's only when you see that sort of thing that you realize we are in a very different world to our own Google age.
I think this, to me resonates a lot because, my grandma, before she passed away, it was always contested when she was born because
Right.
there's no records of it anywhere. And, being from the region that she's from in Iraq, nobody was keeping record at the time. But, she is certain that she experienced the 1920s revolution in Iraq against the British Army. But, people are saying, no, you're a bit younger than that. You wouldn't have experienced it. And she was like, I remember it clearly. I remember the soldiers. I remember the fighting and stuff like that. And so it really resonates. So I want to ask you, based on that, do you think this is a human thing, or do you think, culture and community has a role to play in that?
Yeah, exactly. Culture and community is what it's all about. And I think that's a fascinating story about your grandma. And also, I think underlines just how close we are to those cultures that didn't have the details. I mean, there's people in my family too. And my mother thought she was born on one day, turned out she was born on another day. And we're only a generation or two since that time when people didn't always know exactly when they were born. So it's not that far away, but Google and the web and everything has just revolutionized everything. But and also in a way, what does it matter, the exact dates? What is it? Somehow in our own culture, knowing the exact date has become this sort of rarefied thing. It's so important to be precise on these things. Whereas ancient cultures knew that actually what was more important was, kind of roughly when and how do you connect with the bigger picture of what's happening. But these things are all about community and culture and making sense of the world, and a world that often seems kind of arbitrary and crazy. And particularly in the first century, life expectancy was very short. You never knew what was going to carry you away, or carry away a person in your family. So that whole thing about making sense of life, making sense of death was incredibly important, and plugging into those ancient stories that have carried people for centuries, and that are so important. And the whole story of Jesus is, of course, yet another aspect of that Jewish story. And so for the first Christians, has to be plugged into the story of Israel too.
Do you think for historians, especially for historians who look back at ancient times, and in your case, for a Christian historian or biblical historian, do you think like the sort of the Google revolution, do you think that makes things harder or makes it easier? Because fundamentally, like, to me, it just sounds like you're having to navigate tons more information, and that could be all sorts of inaccurate or accurate. So what does that mean for you? Or what does that mean for future generations? Sorry.
Yeah, well, yeah. I know it will be very interesting in 2,000 years' time to see how people write up the history. I mean, it's human nature to put your own interpretation on facts. And of course, that will still go on. And even the choice of what you write about, you write about something because you think it has something to say today. It's not completely arbitrary that I'm writing about the first century and I'm writing about characters that I think still have some resonance today. But it will be very interesting to see how people do ancient history in 2,000 years' time. Even just 1,000 years' time. Will we still have computers that can Google? Maybe some of this stuff will be lost, but my sense is that there will just be lots more information. And that'll be a bit of a shame, because actually what I quite like is the lack of information in the ancient world. But I do think that the modern Google kind of way of looking at the world is something that actually makes it quite difficult for people, and certainly for my students. I have to very much kind of say to them, get out of this Google mindset, get out of the way of thinking that you can just look up details, even that you can just have a Bible in front of you and check a quotation. That's not the case in the ancient world. Torah scrolls or biblical scrolls were really expensive. Probably most synagogues didn't even have a full set. So most people are going by memory, which of course is faulty. They can't look things up. And so it's a sort of approximation. And once you start talking about approximations, you change a text subconsciously, perhaps in a way that suits what you want to say better. You remember things in a way that suits what you want to say better. So yeah, I think Google has changed things, even now for people studying history, but it will be very interesting to see how that plays out in 1,000 or 2,000 years' time.
Now, looking at all these authors and biographers that you looked at, ancient biographers and presumably modern ones, in your own writing, how much influence do you think they've had on your own particular writing or your literary style? Do you think that's had an influence on you?
That's an interesting question. I guess it's one of the things that I noticed. I did read a lot of stuff from modern biographers, particularly modern biographers reflecting on their craft. And I noticed quite a few similarities, although ancient biographies are different. There were some similarities. And one of the things that I was constantly struck by is this idea that biography is also autobiography, that we write about subjects that interest us and that we think are still important today. And on one level, of course, that's obvious, but it is worth thinking about how that alters the way we go about looking for these people. Of course, I'm writing about Mark writing about Jesus, so I've got that kind of double level there. But of course, I'm looking at Jesus because I think Jesus still is relevant today. I'm unlikely to conclude that he has nothing to say to the modern world. So I think it all of that does make you question your own sort of work, your own preconceptions. To ask what am I actually doing here? Am I going about this in as objective a way as I would like to think? And what are the things that are having a bearing on me? But in terms of my own literary style, I love reading. I read all the time. I like a good murder. I like a good murder before I go to sleep. And the gorier the better. I'm a big fan of Val McDermid or P.D. James. I like Victorian novels. I love Anthony Trollope. So I suppose those are the things that I like to read and that inform the way I write.
And this is incredibly fascinating for me because, when fast forward, maybe like a couple 100 years and someone picks up the book that you've written on, the history of Jesus, and they will never know the influences that you had, and what helped you shape, the way you write and sort of the way you research and the lenses that you're using, which is, ultimately, in my mind, I think this is what makes religion incredibly powerful, is that there's this element of randomness that exists in it, but the essence fundamentally still remains.
I think there is more of a movement in amongst historians now to sort of be upfront about your influences, and certainly, I mean, I think that there's also that sort of, British reserve. I don't want to start a book with, well, here's me, and this is all the things that has influenced me. And I suppose I feel a bit uncomfortable about doing that. But at the same time, I absolutely don't think that I'm being objective. I don't think anyone is objective. We all strive for that, but I think that's sort of an unattainable thing. That the most we can do is be aware of what it is that influences us. I mean, a decade or so ago, I wrote a book on the high priest Caiaphas, and as I was working on that, I was very influenced or very much kind of thinking back to my first school was a Roman Catholic convent school. And I found lots of kind of connections there between the priesthood there and the priesthood as I was sort of thinking about it in these Jewish texts. And, you know, again, I didn't want to make a big thing about, oh, well, you know, these are my influences, but I couldn't help be thinking, you know, these are, I'm sure, my early influences, and the way that people treated Catholic priests had an influence on the way that I was now writing about the priesthood many decades later. And I think we should be more upfront about our interests and reasons for writing, but that does require you to be very introspective and honest too, and that is quite hard.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's extremely uncomfortable. What advice would you give young or up and coming biblical historians and people researching this sort of field?
Oh, just to read the ancient sources, I think. I love Josephus. He's quite a rascal, and he had a very colourful life. He was a Jewish priest who was a general in Galilee, first of all in the Jewish war with Rome, and then, well, basically he was a pretty rubbish general, I think. The Romans took over his the city that he was in charge of, and he changed allegiance. Suddenly he became the great Roman, and he was on the Roman side. And then he went to Rome and he started to write some histories of Judea, and they are fascinating in terms of just setting out that context. In no other Roman province do we have so much information, and so it's just amazing that happens to be the case with Israel. And yet we've also got, you know, the Gospels and the texts. So I think read lots of ancient literature, read biography, because it is quite like the Gospels. Look at archaeological stuff, because there's loads of that. Things like the Biblical Archaeology Review, and just immerse yourself in that ancient world, because it is different. You know, the past is a foreign country, and we do need to kind of change our mindset if we're going to try and understand ancient authors.
Where can people find more of your work, or you know, reach out to you?
My website at Edinburgh University, the School of Divinity. There's contact details there, and I get a lot of emails from people, and I do try to respond to them. Not always possible, depends what they ask, but I do try to respond to people.
Are you on Twitter by any chance?
No, I'm not great on social media. I'm on Instagram, actually. Yeah, I'm on Instagram. I joined that about a year or so ago, so I thought I needed to up my social media game. Yeah. So I am on that. But email is kind of my instrument of choice, I
mean, whichever you'd like. We'll link it on the episode anyway, so people can get directed.
Yeah, Instagram is good.
Well, Helen, it's been super interesting speaking to you. I find your research fascinating, and I hope to have you on at some point in the future.
Well, thank you very much. It's been lovely to talk to you too.
Okay, yeah.
So that's a thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope to have you on for your next bit of research.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at the Know Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, the Know Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.